I'm Rob Moore.
I'm Lee Moore.
And I'm Brandon False.
The second time around with Brandon False. This is the Chinese Literature Podcast. Brandon was with us for the Phoenix Podcast.
The Junkyard one.
The Junkyard Podcast.
Poetry.
That's it. Today we're talking about one of the great classics of
Just
Chinese
like the
literature.
Junkyard poem.
Just like the Junkyard poem. I was about to say only easier to relate to, but I'm not actually sure that's true. It's the source of innumerable film adaptations and TV shows, but that doesn't exactly, if you read it, it's not particularly relatable.
It's really hard. It's really long. I mean, it's very long, but it's so famous in Chinese literature.
We're speaking, of course, of Journey to the West.
Xi
That we didn't plan to do that in unison. That was just a lucky, Lee and I are just locked in that way,
Brothers from another mother.
That's it. But COG is really one of those stories that everybody in China knows, or at least has heard about. Although, I would argue most have not read in its entirety.
It's almost always, because it's 100 chapters long. So in English, I think this comes out to 4 or 5 volumes.
It's like 2,000 pages. Like, I tried to read this, the English translation, like my second year in China. And about page 490, I was like, are you kidding me? There's another 1,500 pages of this?
Here's the thing. If you don't know how to read it, which is how Brandon and I first started out reading it, it really gets boring really fast.
The trick, though, is even if you know how to read it, you're going to have to read it for a really long time.
Yeah.
Like, this is not one of those, even Anna Karenina, War and Peace, novels that in English are known for being long. Those are kind of over in about 800 pages. Double it, and you're still not at the end of Journey to the West.
If you're reading like War and Peace, there's a plot. There's a linear plot. That's something that we as contemporary Western readers expect from a novel. But that's not what we get in Journey.
Journey to the West, and I'll summarize it real quick so that we can jump into the actual discussion. But Journey to the West is a picaresque novel, which means it focuses on a journey. It does have a goal. The shell of the story is a monk whose name is Tang Zeng, and his 3 acolytes, or his 3 followers, Monkey and Pig and Friar Sand and Horse. Did I say 3 acolytes? Okay. I thought he had 3 acolytes and then a horse.
Yeah.
Anyway, I think of it as 3 acolytes and then a horse.
Well, altogether there's 5 characters, right?
Right.
So,
Yeah.
So,
the 5 characters are moving west across China into India to bring back the sacred scriptures to China, the sacred Buddhist scriptures. That's the shell of the plot. How exactly the characters come into the story, what they're doing there, how long they last, that's the whole work. Each character has their own sort of entrance, or their own origin story, if you want to think of it that way, if you want to think of it in comic terms. But the most famous character in the story is Monkey. Now, we had talked right beforehand, the 3 of us, about how to deal with names. Because I was telling Lee and Brandon, well, we have to summarize this, so let's get the names down. And I said Monkey, and then someone said, well, he's actually Sun Wukong, that's his Chinese name. And someone else said, he's actually Monkey King in some places. So,
He's
Pilgrim.
Great,
Pilgrim,
as
yeah.
well, and
what else?
Great
Great
Sage.
Sage equal to heaven.
Great Sage equal to heaven.
So one of the weird things about this novel is every time they have an encounter with a monster, they always have to figure out the right names. So, they'll start fighting. I think because these different disciples come to Monk at different times early in the novel. And what inevitably happens is they'll start fighting with this monster, and then they'll, beat each other up, and then
Why didn't you tell me before?
Why didn't you tell me that was your name?
Told me who you were. We know we're looking for you right now.
Yeah,
right?
so Monkey. So I'm thinking specifically of Horse, who starts out as a dragon. Monkey fights him. Monkey and Piggy fight him at several points, and they're just kind of going back and forth. And then they ask each other. They ask each other what their name is, and the dragon says, "Oh, I'm so and so. I'm this dude who was sent by Guan Yin to eventually carry the monk to pick up the holy books in India and bring them back to China." And they're like, "Oh, we were looking for you. Why didn't you just start out telling us that?"
Yeah. And I think that's a good place to start because Guan Yin comes
Hang on. Can we jump in real quick? So Guan Yin is who?
Who was Guan Yin?
Guan Yin is the Buddhist goddess of mercy. She is originally a figure in Indic Buddhism, but she becomes very, very big in Chinese Buddhism, in Japanese, Korean Buddhism.
And she's a really tasty tea.
Yes, Tia Guan Yin. Iron Buddha tea, they call it sometimes. It's amazing. That's the oolong tea of choice in China. Sorry, I cut Brandon off, but so Guan Yin.
So, I mean, I think that's important to the story. She comes along, I believe, in Chapter 8, and basically scouts out these people, and each of the monsters and the people who are following or accompanying the monk on this journey had transgressed or did something bad in their previous life.
So Monkey actually, the whole first 6 books, I think, are him, like, he just kind of, like, appears out of nowhere, out of creation.
Yes.
And then he goes up to heaven and he asks for a job, and the emperor gives him a crap job. Quite literally, he's cleaning up the crap in the horse stables, the like heavenly horse stables, and then he's kind of like, to heck with this, I'm going to go and like overthrow heaven, and he almost completely overthrows heaven. So it's this weird thing. He gets punished by being put under the 5 Phases mountain and imprisoned.
Before that, doesn't he get another job where he's guarding the peaches?
He does, yeah. So he gets another job where he's guarding the peaches, and he eats all the immortal peaches. And so they eventually, like, he tries to lead his monkey army to destroy heaven, and he gets imprisoned essentially in this kind of like hell. And Guan Yin says, you can come out if you convert to Buddhism, and agree to do this trip to bring the Holy Scriptures back to China from India.
So 2 things here. One, first, if you get a chance, one of the most interesting animated clips I've ever seen is an animated feature called Rebellion in Heaven, done about Monkey's rebellion in heaven. And the entire thing is drawn and scored like a Peking opera. So that's the music, the movements, everything is Peking opera, and it's utterly fascinating. You can find it on YouTube, so definitely look for it. The second, we've all lived in China for various periods of time, so back me up if you think this is correct, but the most popular character is Monkey.
In fact, sometimes it's just called the monkey, right?
Yeah, I think one of the translations is just called Monkey. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's interesting, too, because it's ostensibly a novel about this monk.
Right.
But he's the most boring character ever.
Yes. He's the straight man. If this was the Marx Brothers, he would be Zeppo.
If I could drop in here with a Western thing, if you've ever read Dante.
Yeah.
So the Inferno is actually incredibly interesting. Mm-hmm. But when you get to Purgatorio, Paradiso, it's actually really boring.
Yeah.
And
very.
The reason is because, like, the bad guy is the fun guy.
Yeah.
Like, it
and there's also in Journey to the West, there's this play early on. You can see that there's this distinction between humans and animals, right? And so there's the monk who's the human, and then the people who are accompanying him on this journey are all animals. But what I find interesting is that it's easier to associate or to identify with the monsters, the animals.
Interesting.
Within these characters, whereas like the monk is kind of repulsive. He's just a crybaby. He's always whining.
He's too human.
You're
too right. Human. I hadn't thought of that. Yeah, he's like perfect. He's too perfect.
Which is why there's a lot of other similar works like that. I would argue even in the West, where it's the prankster, it's the villain, it's the Han Solo that
Brer
everyone
Rabbit.
wants. Brer Rabbit, or if you read Paradise Lost, Satan is the reason people read Paradise Lost. So.
Jesus is so freaking
kind of whatever. Yeah.
And you could really read the story as the monk's, it's the monk's journey or quest to become more human. Early on, he's born as just a regular. Did I say monk? I meant monkey.
Oh,
so he's born as a regular monkey, right? And then he starts wearing humans' clothing, and he enters the human world.
So he comes at a lot of what we might call the interior appreciation of the human in modern Chinese novels. Like when we were talking about May 4th literature, for example, it's very self-consciously serious and reflective. And based on what Brandon was just saying, you can read Monkey as making a journey towards that, but through entirely supernatural avenues. And that's a fascinating thing because he fights it the whole way. It's not like he starts out like the Tin Man and the Wizard of Oz or Data in Star Trek The Next Generation going, I want to know what it means to be human. Monkey's like, psh, I don't care. I'm an immortal monkey, but he gets dragged into it.
Yeah, and for the class that Lee and I took this past quarter, our professor started the course the first day by reading a story. I don't remember the name of the story, but the main character was, I believe, named Mulian. It's a story or a text that was found in the Dunhuang caves.
Yeah, I don't actually remember the name of the story either, but it was found in Dunhuang. It's like a...
And it predates Tang Dynasty, maybe Tang Dynasty.
I think it might be Tang Dynasty, yeah, or maybe Song Dynasty. I don't know.
And she set up basically the story of Journey to the West by first reading the short story. And there's a lot of parallels between that monk or that character and Tang Song in Journey to the West.
And we should mention that this... So you're bringing up a really good point. This story is based on... a lot of oral tradition. There are a lot of elements of orality in this story. And by that, what we mean is it's kind of a story cycle in the way that Homer was in ancient Greece. And its composition seems like it might be kind of similar to something that is, what's the word? Epic. So it's this story, I mean, we know a name of the guy who might be the author, Wu Cheng'en, but we don't really know if he's the author, and we don't know how much kind of he actually brought in. So that's kind of like that. We definitely do have this story from Dunhuang that seems a lot like it.
Yeah, so, and if you read the introduction, which is 100 pages, just the introduction to this.
This is Anthony Yu's introduction.
Anthony Yu's, translation. And it kind of sets up from the Tang Dynasty, where they're tracking to see when this story begins to emerge, and they find shorter texts like 30 chapters, or until it finally, I think, in the late Ming Dynasty becomes what is the 100 chapter, the final product that we have today.
You bring up something interesting that I'd like to turn the discussion to, and that's structure.
Okay.
So the novel is 100 chapters long. And that number is not accidental. All Ming Qing novels chose the number of chapters that they were very carefully. So the novel is episodic. It has 100 chapters. There are 81 different adventures, and 81 is an important number because it's 9 times 9, and 9 in Chinese literature is a big...
Yang.
Yeah, it's a very, male, penis-oriented number. For some reason.
Lee keeps outing himself as the Freudian in the group. No matter how much he fights it, he keeps coming back to it.
Well, while we're talking about the phallic aspects of the work, I think it's important to talk about the monsters in there.
Yeah.
They're weapons of choice, right? So the monkey has this staff, or this
magic
rod,
staff.
this magic rod,
staff, yeah.
that keeps growing in length throughout the story, and I think
it can. Let's be very specific here. The rod can grow or shorten depending on what he needs and who he needs to be.
And yes, true. And over the course of the novel or the book, he's trying to contain or to control his rod, right? Which is very similar to the Taoist.
And Monkey, especially at the beginning of the novel, spends a lot of time in caves. So I mean, this is all. I mean, Rob, you're right. I might be the Freudian,
but I'm not getting why caves. Why does that matter?
Oh, I mean, because he's taking his rod and he's
dark, damp,
in a dark, damp hole. So I mean, this is not just me who's making this up, and this. I believe that Qing Dynasty and Ming Dynasty commentators were talking about how vaginal some of the imagery and how phallic some of the imagery in this novel is.
Yeah, and Guan Yin has the vase, right? And the vase is definitely symbolic of the...
Yeah. This is, I mean, I may be a Freudian, I'll admit it, but I'm not just making this stuff up.
So there's a clear, or at least some Qing commentators have highlighted some clear phallic, or at least Freudian, what we would call Freudian overtones in this.
I think so. That's my understanding, yeah. We've only read Liu Yiming. Is that his name? Liu Yiming.
Liu Yiming, yeah.
Liu Yiming as the only commentator that we read in class about this. But,
So, Let's go for it.
Sorry, structure. So structurally, this novel is interesting because essentially you have 100 chapters, and it's, I believe, it's divided in half. Chapter 49 to 50 is the halfway point, and at that point they kind of cross a river, and there's all this kind of interesting stuff going on structurally. And one of the ways to read this is coming from Andrew Plax, and Andrew Plax is our professor, so we're sort of like indebted to Plax, the Plaxian reading.
Plaks.
Plaks, yes.
Not the plaque on your teeth.
Not the plaque on your teeth.
Although, no.
No.
Anyways, so I mean, there's just a lot of interesting stuff going on with the structure. And when I first started reading it, I think we mentioned this before, when we started out reading it, it just doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
And you can only start to make sense of it when you start to kind of like not think of it so much as a novel, but think of it as this kind of rhetorical game that's playing with these structures. So,
which would make it a bit like Alice in Wonderland or Through the Looking Glass that way, both of which you can read as just someone's adventures in this weird place. But there are, Lewis Carroll wrote it as, at least partly, games with logic and mathematics.
So the way that this structure works is each of the characters represents some particular force in the Chinese Wuxing, yeah, the sort of mythological forces. So Wuxing is called the five phases. Yeah, that's metal, earth,
water, wood, and fire.
And fire, yeah. And those are all kind of based around different seasons, and there are all these kind of other associations. Like some of the phases are more male, some of them are more female.
Colors and directions.
Colors and directions, that's true. But what you need to know is that what happens in each of these chapters, pretty much, each of the kind of adventures is, they'll come up, it will be a certain season. And so you should already, if you know that season and what it's associated with, you can already kind of be thinking.
And they'll be moving in a certain direction.
They'll be moving in a certain direction, and they'll have this monster. And this monster will be associated with maybe, like if it's a dragon coming out of the water, then that's going to be hard for Monkey to deal with, because Monkey is associated with fire. And of course, I mean, this is kind of a rock, paper, scissors thing. Water always defeats fire. So Monkey has trouble dealing with water. So we have to bring in the more water kind of guy in the characters, and that's Piggy. So each time this happens, there'll be like, I mean, it's almost kind of like scripted. Like Monkey will try and take care of it, and he can't do it, and so it'll go to Piggy. Or Monkey will be able to do it, and he'll just destroy this thing, or for whatever reason, there's all this kind of weird stuff going on. But once you know this structuralist reading, and that's coming from Andrew Plax, you can kind of actually like make sense of the novel
and enjoy each chapter for what it is.
Which is
one chapter.
but each chapter for what it is like a game, right? Like it's just kind of like a game with all these different things. So you're not reading for plot.
Yeah.
The plot is actually not that interesting.
And yet, to jump in, though, what's fascinating is, and I would agree, because I've tried to read it, and it's ridiculously tedious, it is phenomenally popular. So if you can't read it for plot, or if you shouldn't, why is it so popular?
Let's say this. It's phenomenally popular in China or in Asia.
Yes.
Right? It doesn't really...
No one here knows what it is. But even then... there are, I think, at least 2, probably 3 full television serials. There's a couple of different movies.
There's, I don't know.
It's more than that?
Probably more than that.
Probably more than that. There's a couple of animated features. There's toys galore, children's books. I mean, it's just off the charts. So what y'all are describing that's probably the way I would have to read it. But why does no one read it? Why is it still popular?
Well, because I think that's one of the things that a lot of these early scholars mention is that anyone can read it the way that they want to read it. It could be a Neo-Confucian text, it could be about Taoism, it could be about Buddhism, and so whatever background you come with, you can find what you're looking for in this work, and I think that's what makes it so popular 500 years later.
I would also add to that like, I think that the Chinese readers who are coming at this, they know all of this stuff. Like, it's kind of just something that comes with their growing up. Like, they get the kind of 5 phases things because they're taught that. And when I say that, like, the novel doesn't really have that much of a plot, I don't mean to insult it. Just because it's not a Western-style novel doesn't actually make it illegitimate.
Well, and it doesn't have a plot in the way that the Odyssey doesn't have a plot, which is the Odyssey is just a dude trying to go home. That's the whole story.
And constantly facing these monsters.
That's it. And it's a similar structure. I would argue Journey to the West is way more complex, but in terms of, you were mentioning the 5 phases and whatnot.
Structurally, it's much more complex.
And so it's possible that what you were talking about with the 5 phases is something that Chinese readers simply have, it's just ingrained. But having lived there for 10 years, I'd never heard this term before.
Yeah.
So it may be in the consciousness somewhere, but it's not a conscious thing. So it's like there's a way to appreciate this sort of in a scholarly way, and yet you can still have an incredibly popular TV show based on it. So is there an aspect of this work, like how would you explain... We've talked just a second ago about the popularity, but how would you explain to an American who finds it just incredibly bizarre, and it is, why it's so popular? Why there are TV shows, movies?
I mean, it definitely has to do with the monkey. I think it's probably one of the only, as far as I know, in Chinese literature, one of the main epic heroes or characters. I mean, are there any other ones?
Not really. Yeah, it does. You're right. It does function as a kind of like Chinese epic.
And I think that's why children can learn about it, and it can be kind of written or presented in such a way that is digestible for a 4-year-old, and for a 40-year-old who's
Yeah.
No, it's true. No, I think that's a good point in that we have a few stories like this in the West, but not many that have an element of very complicated narrative structure, but it's also just fun. The Odyssey is a good example.
I would say the kind of the sort of the way Monkey is this anti-authoritarian figure is really fun for kids to read, and it makes him kind of beloved for adults who kind of remember that. I mean, he's this almost satanic Odyssean figure, and I mean that only in the positive ways. But I'm specifically referring to Milton and Homer, of course. He challenges authority, but he eventually kind of like folds into authority and supports authority in a way that's, Chinese orthodoxy.
And it's an interesting character then, because he's someone who is subject to authority throughout the story. And yet it's his own person as well.
Well, do we have any similar stories in Western literature that is really complex but has been kind of revamped and rewritten for a child audience?
I don't know, rewritten. I can't think
Not
of
rewritten, but something that's digestible for a 4-year-old but is really complex, like Shakespeare or something. Do we have any
I can't think
similar,
of anything, no.
Yeah.
The Bible might be close, because there are certain sections of the Bible that are repackaged in children's stories, and yet are not really children's stories. I mean, David and Goliath is a good example. I mean, it's often told in this sort of a whimsical fashion, almost, the underdog story. But the roots of it and history of it are incredibly brutal and violent, and
the story itself
yeah,
is incredibly violent. Like,
I mean, David slays Goliath, hooray! And then what does he do? And they go on, and then he cuts off his head, and they go on to slaughter the army. And it's not a particularly
you couldn't get
story.
that as a PG story.
You could not.
Unless it was David and Goliath. David and Goliath, because it's so often told as David and Goliath, and everybody knows it. No one thinks about it being violent. It passes the smell.
So we've got the sort of popular reading, which involves the prankster, which everybody loves forever, and then we have the. Would you call it a Taoist reading with the 5 phases? How would you label that?
I would say it's more of just traditional Chinese culture. So the Sanjiao, the 3 religions kind of united. I mean, the text is clearly more of a Buddhist text.
Okay.
But there are a lot of Taoist elements in it, and it's fine with Taoism.
Yeah, and I think the story is set up in the very beginning where the monkey wants to, when he leaves his palace, his kingdom early on, he seeks immortality. And he studies with this Taoist master. And so that's kind of setting it up for the Taoist reading.
That Taoist master is the first person to give him his name, which is interesting. Like, before that, he really doesn't have a name. He doesn't have a name that he calls himself.
Yeah. So, they do, by the end of the story, get the scriptures. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. I actually haven't read the end of the story. It's just too long. I never made it that far.
You know, I haven't actually read it either. None of us have read this story to the end.
But to be fair, if you ask a Chinese friend if they've read this, they will probably say, yes, totally read it. And then if you ask them, have you read all 100 chapters, 98% of them will say, well, no, not all of it. But
And I think one of the points that we would like to get across is that you don't actually have to read it to the end.
No.
This is one of those cool stories that you can actually, there are some things that are not so much fun about it, but you don't really have to feel like you have a commitment to the whole thing. I mean, after the first 13 chapters, there's no real plot development. There's only kind of structural development that's interesting. So you can just pick up any chapter between 13 and, I don't know,
98.
98, and just kind of pick up a chapter and read it. And one of the Anthony Yu translations is an abridgment of the whole novel into a single volume. So you can actually just pick that up and kind of play around with it.
Yeah, that's probably a good idea.
Yeah.
I would highly recommend that. The Foreign Languages Press version, which is a translation of the entire thing, is brutal.
Yeah.
Specifically when they start, we started this podcast with names. Translations of this novel, translators have fits with the names, because it's not just the names of the characters, it's the places, it's the demons they face, it's the various mystical powers people wield.
If I could just go ahead and show my colors, and y'all are not responsible, and in fact y'all can condemn this, but I think pretty much anything that the Beijing-based Foreign Language Press does is going to be kind of crap, because I don't know if communists can translate anything.
Wow. Lee labels an entire culture.
Not an entire culture, an entire political system. Just 1.35 billion people. That's it.
So Lee is not opinionated at all, and does not at all draw his opinions from his long stay in Taiwan versus his time on the mainland with the real people. He's spent most of his time with the elites.
He's an elitist.
Yeah, he's an elitist, and he's not really in touch with the proletariat. So.
That's true.
Which is, but it is interesting because we can use this maybe to wrap it up a little bit. But there's an element, if you're going to translate a work like this, you sort of have to pick your direction. Is it going to be the popular work, which is Monkey the Prankster and all of his adventures, or is it going to be the 5 phases oriented, more intellectual structure? Because both require a very different level of investment. You two, Brandon and Lee, read it in class, and if you have this 5 phases idea, it's very interesting. I would question whether it's interesting for 100 chapters, each of which is like 10, 15 pages.
Once you start reading it actually with that 5 phases kind of mentality, like, they're constantly changing things up and playing games with it, and when you're watching for that, it does actually become interesting. I don't know that I'd want to read the whole 100 chapters,
no,
but I could see myself actually being interested for the whole 100
I would definitely want to read the first 13 chapters over, because for our assignment, the first day, we had to read the first 12 chapters, which is half of the first volume. And then we learned about the 5 phases and all these other ways of reading it. And I think it would be really nice to go back and read those first 13 chapters with that in mind. It definitely helped us getting through the rest of the novel, or at least the next 13 chapters. But I think it's, you could read just that first volume, the first 25 chapters, and call it a day.
Yeah.
So maybe the best analog to make for this, for anyone who's just totally unfamiliar with it, is Gulliver's Travels.
Yeah.
Because that was an intensely satirical and political work, and all of that intense satire and political overtone has been lost. There's multiple film adaptations, and it's just such a fun story. People tend to forget that Jonathan Swift wrote it as a fairly brutal attack. And in a similar way here, you have a great story that you could study, and many people have, for many, many years, and not get to the bottom of the symbolism, of the complex structure, and the different ideologies involved.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you want to just leave it there.
You guys have any other thoughts you wanted to share? I think we'll probably talk about at least some of this at a different time, because
Maybe, yeah.
This is such a part of the culture that, we'll probably have to come back to it.
And I think we'll probably do another podcast just coming after this on the Xiao Bu, which it's placed right in the middle of the Xiao Ji. So this is the amendment. How did we translate that? Addendum to the Journey.
You could
to the
say an
West?
addendum or an addition to it. Yeah.
Right. So that comes in the middle of it, and it takes the story of Journey to the West and makes it totally different.
Yeah, that's a different. It's an addition much later on to the story. So, other thoughts, gentlemen?
I think that's it.
That's about it.
Yeah.
Well, I'm Rob Moore.
I'm Lee Moore.
And I'm Brandon Falls.
This is the Chinese Literature Podcast.